Commander Zarthok stood on the bridge of his massive warship and looked at the stars that stretched before him, like diamonds scattered across black cloth, and he felt nothing except a strange emptiness that had been growing inside him for years, now, and he could not understand why victory no longer tasted sweet in his mouth. He was 9 feet tall with black scales covering his body and 4 powerful arms that ended in claws sharp enough to tear through metal, and his species, called the Drakon, had conquered most of the known galaxy through sheer force and superior weapons and brilliant military strategy that no other race could match. For 200 years, Zarthok had led the Empire's armies from world to world and species to species, and everywhere he went the same pattern repeated itself with predictable efficiency and boring sameness that made each conquest blur into the next until he could barely remember which world was which anymore. First came the warnings that gave planets time to prepare their defenses and gather their armies and pray to whatever gods they believed in, and then came the invasion that crushed those defenses like paper under his warship's weapons, and finally came the occupation that transformed free civilizations into servants of the Empire. 1,047 worlds had fallen to his command, and that number should have filled him with pride. But instead it just felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe, and he wondered when exactly the thrill of conquest had turned into this gray routine that stretched endlessly before him. His officers respected him, and his enemies feared him, and the Empire celebrated him as the greatest military commander in 10,000 years of Drakon history. But none of that mattered when he was alone in his quarters, staring at star charts and trying to remember why any of this had ever seemed important. Then came the humans, and everything changed in ways he could never have predicted. Intelligence reports about Earth had been sitting on his desk for 3 months, and he kept reading them over and over because something about these creatures fascinated him in a way that other species never had, and he could not quite explain what made them different. Humans were weak by galactic standards, with soft bodies that bruised easily, and short lifespans that barely gave them time to learn anything useful, and primitive technology that lagged centuries behind Drakon engineering. And yet something in their files made him hesitate to give the order to attack. Their literature was filled with stories of underdogs who won against impossible odds, and their history showed a pattern of surviving things that should have destroyed them. And their culture seemed built around this strange belief that losing only mattered if you stopped trying. And Zarthok found this attitude both foolish and oddly compelling. So instead of sending an invasion fleet, he sent a message that offered humanity a choice between peaceful submission and total destruction. And he gave them 3 months to decide, and he told himself he was being merciful. But really he was just curious to see what they would do. When the human delegation arrived, Zarthok expected a large group of politicians and generals and scientists, all talking at once and trying desperately to negotiate better terms for their surrender. But instead, only one man stepped off the transport ship. His name was Daniel Price, and he looked completely ordinary in every possible way, with brown hair starting to turn gray, an average height for a human, and a simple black suit that humans wore for formal occasions. And nothing about his appearance suggested he was anything special or dangerous or worth remembering. But his eyes caught Zarthok's attention immediately because they showed no fear at all, and instead held a calm, measuring quality, like Daniel was studying an interesting puzzle rather than facing the being who could order his entire species destroyed with a single word. The conference room was designed to intimidate visitors, with harsh lighting and walls made of black stone and chairs sized for Drakon, bodies that made smaller species feel tiny and helpless. But Daniel just sat down in one of the human-sized chairs that had been brought in and waited patiently for the commander to speak. Zarthok entered with his full entourage of guards and advisors, and he made sure to use his full height to tower over the human, and he spoke in his most commanding voice about how resistance was futile and surrender was the only logical choice, and he expected Daniel to tremble, or beg, or at least show some sign of proper respect. Instead, Daniel leaned back in his chair like he was relaxing in his own home and said, "Thank you for meeting with me," in a tone that suggested Zarthok had done him a favor, rather than summoning him to discuss his species' conquest. Then Daniel said something that changed everything when he calmly announced that humanity had reviewed the surrender terms and decided to decline, and Zarthok felt shock run through his body because no species ever declined when faced with overwhelming military superiority. The silence in the room felt thick enough to touch, and Zarthok's second-in-command made a sound of pure disbelief, because this simply did not happen, and conquered species did not refuse, and certainly did not do it with such casual confidence. Zarthok leaned forward and reminded Daniel that the Drakon Empire had crushed civilizations 1,000 times more powerful than Earth, and possessed weapons that could sterilize planets before primitive defenses could even respond, and that he personally had conquered 1,047 worlds. Daniel nodded like this was interesting information rather than a terrifying threat, and then he asked a question that made Zarthok pause because no one had ever asked him this before, and he did not have a ready answer. The human wanted to know when the last time was that any of those 1,047 conquests had actually challenged Zarthok in any meaningful way, and whether he was here to conquer Earth because he needed their resources or because he was simply bored. The question struck something deep inside Zarthok, because it was true that most conquests had become routine and predictable, and the last real challenge had been decades ago, and he had been feeling that strange emptiness for so long now that he had almost forgotten what genuine excitement felt like. Daniel continued speaking in that same calm, reasonable tone, and said that Zarthok counted his victories like they were medals and wore them with pride. But that keeping count suggested the number mattered to him, and that maybe he was searching for something that conquest could never actually provide. Then Daniel did something even more surprising, when he stood up and walked slowly around the table toward Zarthok, and none of the guards stopped him because they all seemed as fascinated by this strange human as their commander was. Daniel asked if Zarthok wanted to know what made humans different, and when the commander said yes, the human explained that it was not technology or military strength, but something much simpler and much more dangerous. Humans did not play the game of dominance that every other species played, and when faced with superior force, they did not ask if they could win, but instead asked what winning even meant, and then they changed all the rules entirely. Daniel said that the Drakon Empire was built on fear and resentment and barely suppressed rebellion that required constant military presence to maintain, and that this was not real strength but just exhaustion, waiting to happen. Then came the offer that would change both their lives, when Daniel proposed a challenge and said that Zarthok should give him 1 year living aboard this ship among the crew, and if at the end of that time the commander still believed humanity should be conquered, then humans would submit without any resistance. Zarthok asked what would happen if he refused this absurd offer, and Daniel replied that then Zarthok would conquer humanity conventionally and add them to his list and spend the rest of his life wondering if there had been something more to humans than met the eye. The commander felt his hearts beating faster than they had in 50 years because this human had walked onto his warship and faced certain death without fear and offered not surrender, but a mystery wrapped in a challenge. It was illogical and violated every protocol and made no strategic sense whatsoever. But it was also the most interesting thing that had happened to Zarthok in decades. So he agreed to 1 year with Daniel as his guest, under constant monitoring, with the understanding that any sign of sabotage would result in immediate execution and the conquest of Earth. Daniel extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, and Zarthok carefully gripped it with one of his clawed hands and said that he had conquered 1,047 worlds, and Daniel should not make him regret this decision. Daniel smiled and said he would do his best, and something in his tone suggested he meant something completely different than what Zarthok understood as the commander left the conference room. He felt uncertainty for the first time in a very long time, and he realized that Daniel Price had been aboard his ship for less than an hour, and had already made the great Zarthok question his own assumptions about power and conquest and the meaning of his entire life. Month 9 brought an event that would force the confrontation both Zarthok and Daniel had been circling around, when a species called the Krell suddenly went silent across 5 different colony worlds. The Krell were insect-like beings that the Empire had conquered 40 years earlier, and they had been reduced to a labor caste that worked in mines and factories across multiple planets, and they had caused no significant trouble for decades. But now 3,000 Krell colonists and 200 Drakon overseers on Colony Sigma 7 had simply stopped communicating, and when supply ships arrived, they found the spaceport abandoned with life support running. but no one responding to any messages. Intelligence reports showed the same pattern on 4 other Krell colonies, and all 5 had gone dark within a 6-hour window, which meant this was coordinated and planned. Zarthok ordered the Eternal Dominion to Sigma-7 immediately, and during the emergency briefing his officers concluded this was obviously a rebellion and standard protocol required finding the leaders and executing them publicly. Daniel spoke up from his usual corner and suggested that maybe they should not assume the worst before they actually knew what was happening. The briefing room went silent because it was one thing for Daniel to offer suggestions during routine operations, but another thing entirely to question military protocol during an active security crisis. Fleet Commander Scarveth, who was participating by holo communication, said the human should be removed from the briefing, because this was not his concern. Zarthok surprised himself by saying Daniel would stay, because his perspective had proven useful, and he told the human to continue. Daniel said there could be alternative explanations like equipment failure or environmental hazard or some emergency that required evacuation, and making assumptions before having data could lead to inappropriate responses. Scarveth said the Krell were barely sentient insects, and the only thing they understood was dominance and force. Daniel asked if anyone had ever actually talked to a Krell and not given them orders or processed them through systems, but actually had a real conversation about their thoughts and feelings and culture. Relkath said the Krell did not have culture because they were a hive species that only cared about the collective. Daniel countered that even hive species had individual variations, but his main point was that they were planning to execute people before even knowing what happened. And that was not justice or even effective security, but just violence, because violence was their default setting. Zarthok raised a hand for silence and decided they would investigate first and determine appropriate action afterward. When the landing party reached Sigma-7, they found the colony's entrance unsealed but not forced, and emergency lighting cast everything in dim red illumination. They advanced through empty corridors, finding no signs of struggle or damage, and when they reached the central habitation dome, they discovered something completely unexpected. All 3,000 Krell plus the 200 Drakan overseers were sitting in complete silence, and the Krell formed organized groups that might have been families or work units, while the Drakan sat separately. No one attacked or fled, and they just sat there with thousands of eyes watching the landing party enter. An older female, Krell with patterns on her carapace that indicated age and authority, stood up and said in the Krell language that they had been waiting for Commander Zarthok to arrive. Zarthok demanded an explanation for why they had ceased communications and stopped working. The Krell elder said simply that they were remembering. When Zarthok asked what they were remembering, she gestured to a younger Krell, barely adult, and told her to explain what she had learned. The young Krell named Jiktal spoke with a trembling voice and said she had found old data files in the colony archives from before the conquest, and these files showed Krell civilization before the Drakan came. She explained that Krell had cities and not just mines and labor camps, but real cities with art and music and philosophy and science, and they were exploring space and making first contact with other species and building a future. Then the Drakan arrived and evaluated them and determined they would make efficient laborers and systematically destroyed everything that made them who they were. Jiktal said their cities were demolished and cultural records were erased, and their children were raised to believe that working in mines was the highest purpose they could achieve. She said 4 generations of Krell had been born knowing only servitude and believing this was all they were meant for. Scarveth's voice came through the communicator saying the Krell were livestock and useful animals, and the Empire gave them purpose. Jiktal's voice rose as she shouted that they had purpose and they had civilization, and the Drakan took it from them because they were not strong enough to stop it. The dome filled with clicking and whistling, as thousands of Krell responded with their own voices expressing anger and grief and loss that Zarthok suddenly realized he had never heard from them before. Relkath raised his weapon and said this was a rebellion, but the Krell elder said firmly that they were not rebelling or fighting. She explained they were doing something the Empire had never confronted before because they were simply refusing. Zarthok asked what they were refusing, and the elder said they were refusing to forget who they were and refusing to work without acknowledgement of what was taken from them and refusing to raise another generation that believed slavery was identity. The elder said they knew they could not defeat the Drakon militarily, because they had learned what happened to 17 other species who tried, so they were not fighting, but just stopping. She said if the only way the Empire could make them work was through force, then let the galaxy see the Drakon reduced to slave drivers, with whips. Zarthok said they would starve because the Empire would not provide resources to non-productive colonies. The elder replied calmly that then they would starve, but they would starve as Krell, remembering who they were rather than living as mindless workers. Having forgotten their own names, Scarveth's voice crackled with authorization to deploy pacification protocols that would have them back to work within a week. Zarthok looked at the assembled Krell and at the Drakon overseers sitting silent among them, and at the thousands of faces waiting for his response. Then he looked at Daniel Price, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, and he asked quietly what humans would do. Daniel stepped forward carefully and approached the Krell elder and asked if he could speak with her. The elder's antennae twitched in surprise, and she said they had heard of the human who walked freely among the conquerors. Daniel said he walked among them, but not freely, because he carried the weight of knowing what they planned for his people, just as she carried the weight of what they had already done to hers. He turned to address the crowd and said that on Earth humans had fought wars over things like this and resisted oppression and staged rebellions and died for freedom, and sometimes they won and sometimes they lost. But Daniel said the most effective resistance was not always the most violent, and he supported their right to remember who they were but worried about consequences. Huey explained that peaceful resistance only worked if opponents had some capacity for shame and some moral framework that could be appealed to. Daniel asked if the Drakon Empire had that capacity, because if it did not, then the Krell would die here, and no one would remember their sacrifice. The elder asked what Daniel suggested, and he said that Zarthok was standing right here listening, which was more than any Krell had gotten in 40 years. Daniel said this moment right now was an opportunity, not for rebellion and not for submission, but for negotiation, and finding a third path no one had considered yet. He turned to Zarthok and said the commander had conquered 1,047 worlds, and the Krell was one of them. But what if conquest did not have to mean erasure? Daniel asked if there was a way for the Empire to benefit from Krell labor without requiring them to forget their own culture. Zarthok said the Empire did not negotiate with conquered species, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel pressed and asked why not and who made that rule, and more importantly, who benefited from that rule. He said Zarthok had spent 9 months talking about human perspectives and implementing changes that improved morale and efficiency and resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than force. So why did this have to be different? Scarveth's voice interrupted, saying it was different because they were Krell and insects, and the moment they showed weakness, every subjugated species would demand the same consideration. Daniel said loudly enough for his voice to carry through the communicator that maybe they should, and maybe an empire that ruled through fear of its own subjects was not as strong as it thought. He said maybe true strength was building a civilization people wanted to be part of rather than one they were forced into. The silence that followed was absolute, because Daniel had just challenged not only Zarthok's decision, but the entire foundation of the Drakon Empire's political structure. Zarthok felt 2 centuries of certainty warring with 9 months of accumulated doubt, because everything he had built was based on the premise that strength meant dominance and power meant control. Standing in this dome looking at 3,000 Krell who would rather starve than forget their names, and watching Daniel advocate for people who were not even his own species, Zarthok confronted a truth. 3 months passed since Daniel Price came aboard the Eternal Dominion, and Commander Zarthok watched his carefully ordered military vessel slowly become something he did not quite recognize anymore. At first, Daniel did exactly what was expected, and he stayed in his assigned quarters and observed the ship's operations from a distance, and asked polite questions about Drakon culture, and kept mostly to himself, while the crew regarded him with curiosity mixed with contempt. But then, Daniel started talking to people and not interrogating them for information, but just having normal conversations about ordinary things like hobbies and interests and the small details that made up individual lives beyond military duty. The first sign of trouble came during a command briefing when Lieutenant Kreshtal made an unusual tactical suggestion about varying patrol routes to make them less predictable, and Zarthok asked where this idea came from. The lieutenant's scales darkened with embarrassment as he admitted that Daniel had mentioned something during breakfast about Earth naval tactics from their Second World War, and how they protected supply ships by varying convoy patterns, and this made Kreshetal think about whether Drakon patrols were too predictable. Zarthok felt irritation rising because his tactical officer was taking ideas from a human whose species they planned to conquer, but he also had to admit that the suggestion was good and made strategic sense. The pattern continued over the following weeks as more crew members started having conversations with Daniel, and each time the human just told stories about Earth history, or discussed human culture, or asked questions about Drakon traditions, and somehow these casual conversations were changing how his officers thought about their duties. Zarthok confronted Daniel in the observation lounge where the human often sat watching the stars stream past during faster-than-light travel, and he accused Daniel of corrupting his officers with stories. Daniel looked up without surprise and said that corrupting was a strong word, and he was just passing time with conversation, because the crew members were very curious about Earth, and he was simply answering their questions. The commander settled into one of the large chairs and asked what Daniel was really trying to accomplish and what his strategy was. Daniel replied that there was no strategy, and he was just getting to know people and building relationships and sharing stories because that is what humans do, and he could not help Zarthok understand humanity while sitting alone in his quarters. Zarthok said there was no common ground between Drakon and humans, but Daniel disagreed and listed several crew members by name and described personal details about their lives that the commander had never known. Despite serving with some of them for decades, Daniel explained that Ensign Trackmore collected crystals from every world he visited and had over 400 specimens, and scientist Velthus wrote poetry about nebulas, and Subcommander Relkath had a mate and 2 offspring he had not seen in 5 years because of deployment. The human pointed out that people on Earth also collected things and wrote poetry and sacrificed time with families for duty. And these were not species-specific traits, but just common features of intelligent beings with internal lives that extended beyond their assigned roles. Zarthok dismissed this as sentiment that was irrelevant to military effectiveness, but Daniel challenged him by asking how many of his 1,047 conquests had relied entirely on force versus requiring him to understand enemy psychology and cultural values. The silence that followed was answer enough because many of Zarthok's greatest victories had come from understanding his opponents well enough to manipulate them into defeat rather than just overwhelming them with firepower. Weeks later, a crisis developed when a mining colony lost power due to solar flares, and standard protocol was to send a repair ship that would arrive in 3 days, while the colony survived on backup systems for 5 days. During the emergency briefing, Daniel suggested that the warship could fabricate replacement power modules and deliver them by shuttle in 18 hours instead of waiting 3 days, and this would reduce discomfort for 3,000 civilian colonists. Relkath objected that they were a warship, not a supply vessel, and such diversion would delay their patrol schedule by 4 hours. But Daniel pointed out that 4 hours of their time would prevent 48 hours of crisis conditions for Drakon civilians. What caught Zarthok's attention was that Daniel immediately cared about the comfort of colonists he would never meet, and who were citizens of an empire planning to conquer his homeworld. When Zarthok asked why Daniel cared about Drakon civilians, the human looked genuinely puzzled and said that they were people experiencing preventable suffering and the ship had capability to prevent it, so why would he not care? The simple statement delivered with such matter-of-fact conviction made Zarthok realize that Daniel's empathy extended beyond his own species and even included potential enemies. The commander ordered implementation of Daniel's suggestion and watched his crew glance at the human with new respect, because Daniel had just advocated for Drakon lives and demonstrated a moral framework that transcended tactical considerations. Over the following months, Daniel became an increasingly familiar presence aboard the ship, and he learned basic Drakon language and attended cultural events, where crew members shared art and music from their homeworld. He started teaching voluntary classes about Earth history and culture during off-duty hours, and attendance grew from a handful of curious junior officers to over 50 regular participants. Daniel discussed human wars and peace movements and art and philosophy, and the constant tension between humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction. He explained that humans were a contradiction who could be incredibly violent and incredibly compassionate often at the same time, and understanding humans meant accepting that these contradictions did not cancel each other out, but coexisted in constant, uncomfortable balance. One crew member asked how humans lived with such internal contradiction, and Daniel admitted it was not easy, and humans questioned themselves constantly and debated endlessly about right and wrong and second-guessed their decisions. He said this was exhausting, but also what drove humans to keep trying to be better than they were yesterday, because they knew they were capable of terrible things, so they worked hard to choose better paths even when difficult. After one session, Zarthok confronted Daniel and said he was teaching the crew to doubt themselves when the Drakon way was clarity about knowing who they were and acting accordingly. Daniel replied that the Drakon way had also led to 1,047 conquests, and he was not saying doubt was always good, but a little self-examination could prevent a lot of regret. The human asked how many of those conquests were truly necessary, versus just being what the Empire did out of habit. Zarthok asked necessary for what purpose, and Daniel said exactly, because that was the question humans could not stop asking themselves, and maybe it was time Drakon started asking it too. The 6-month mark brought the most significant change when Zarthok reviewed casualty reports from a skirmish with pirates and noticed that injured pirates had been taken alive and treated for their wounds before being transferred to detention. This was not standard protocol because pirates were enemies worthy only of elimination. So Zarthok went to Medical Bay and demanded an explanation from the chief medical officer. Dr. Kreshovin explained that the pirates had surrendered and were no longer threats, so leaving them to die from treatable injuries seemed unnecessarily cruel. When Zarthok asked, since when Drakon concerned themselves with cruelty toward enemy casualties, the doctor hesitated, and then admitted that Daniel had been assisting in Medical Bay during his free time. The doctor explained that while working together, they discussed Earth medical ethics and the concept of doing no harm, which meant medical practitioners should try to help anyone in need regardless of political affiliation or past actions. Zarthok felt frustration rising and said the human was not a doctor, and his opinions should be irrelevant to Drakon military procedures. Dr. Kreshovin replied that it was not Daniel's opinions that influenced him but his actions, because when injured pirates were brought aboard, Daniel immediately moved to stabilize the most critically wounded one and worked for over an hour, refusing to rest until the patient was stable. The doctor said he watched a human who represented a species the Empire planned to conquer pour all his effort into saving the life of a Drakon pirate who had just been trying to kill them, and Daniel did not ask about authorization or consider political implications, but just saw someone dying who could be saved, and he acted. This made the doctor question why he would not do the same thing. By the 8th month, Zarthok realized he was actively seeking Daniel's perspective on problems, and when trade disputes arose between subjugated species, he asked how humans would resolve them. When rebellions flared on colony worlds, Zarthok consulted Daniel about alternative approaches to simple military suppression. Daniel never claimed to have perfect answers, but offered suggestions and asked questions, and presented alternative perspectives about what rebellious colonies actually wanted and whether compromises existed that could address core concerns without undermining authority. The questions irritated Zarthok because they exposed gaps in his thinking where he had relied on standard procedures. The remaining 3 months aboard the Eternal Dominion passed faster than Zarthok expected, and word of the Krell compromise spread through the fleet, generating responses that ranged from confusion to outrage to quiet support. The Imperial Council demanded explanations, and traditionalist commanders called for Zarthok's removal from command, and Scarveth filed formal complaints about the precedent being set. But the Sigma-7 colony resumed operations with unprecedented efficiency, and Krell workers who now labored as individuals with names and cultural identity proved more productive and innovative than the Empire had ever realized. The weekly cultural day became a showcase of Krell artistry with intricate sculptures carved from mineral deposits and haunting musical compositions created through orchestrated clicking, and mathematical theorems developed through patterns that human and Drakon minds processed differently. More importantly, Krell colonies on other worlds took notice, and quiet requests began filtering through bureaucratic channels, asking if they could have what Sigma-7 had. The requests were politically dangerous and potentially destabilizing, but also utterly reasonable. The Empire faced a choice between crushing the nascent movement to prove the Krell situation was temporary, or allowing the experiment to expand, and risking fundamental alteration of Imperial control. Zarthok found himself at the center of this storm, and for the first time in his military career, he genuinely did not know the right answer. Relkath told him one evening while reviewing reports that he had created a problem, because the Council was calling this the Zarthok precedent, and some saw it as innovation while others saw it as treason. Zarthok asked which Relkath saw it as, and his second-in-command was silent for a long moment, before saying he saw it as complicated. The Krell were happier and more productive and more stable, and by any practical metric, the approach succeeded. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about every other subjugated species. Relkath asked if the Krell deserved cultural recognition. Then why not the others? And Zarthok murmured, "Why not indeed?" As the deadline approached, Daniel continued his quiet presence aboard the ship, and he no longer needed to actively influence the crew, because they had internalized his perspective enough to question their own assumptions. Conversations in dining halls and debates in recreation spaces and arguments between officers meant the ship had become a place where Drakon warriors were thinking deeply about topics they had never considered before. They asked each other what was the difference between strength and cruelty, and could an empire be powerful without being feared, and what made a life well lived and what would they want said about them when their service ended. These were not questions military commanders typically asked themselves, but Daniel had introduced philosophical uncertainty into a culture built on martial clarity, and the effects rippled outward in ways that could not be contained. 2 weeks before the deadline, Zarthok received an unexpected communication when the Imperial Council summoned him to the capital world for a formal inquiry into his command decisions. Relkath said grimly that they were going to remove him from command and possibly court-martial. Zarthok agreed this was possible and looked at Daniel, who had been present for the communication, and asked what else he could do except answer the summons and defend his actions. Relkath suggested half-heartedly that Zarthok could take the Eternal Dominion and go rogue, and some of the fleet would follow him. Zarthok's mandibles clicked in dark amusement, and he said becoming exactly the kind of warlord he spent 2 centuries fighting against was not an option. He said if he believed the Empire could evolve, then he must believe its leadership could be reasoned with, and he would present his case and accept their judgment. Daniel asked quietly if Zarthok would accept judgment, even if that judgment was execution. Zarthok confirmed he would, because some principles were worth dying for, and he was still discovering which ones mattered to him, but thought this might be one of them. The journey to the capital world took 5 days, and during that time Zarthok prepared his defense not as a legal argument, but as a philosophical one. He would tell the council about Daniel Price and about the Krell Compromise and about the gradual realization that conquest alone was insufficient foundation for civilization. He expected they would reject his arguments and see him as corrupted by alien influence and weakened by empathy and compromised by doubt. He expected to be stripped of command and possibly eliminated as a threat to imperial stability. What he did not expect was the scene that greeted him when the Eternal Dominion arrived at the capital, because the council chambers were packed with not just military commanders and political officials, but representatives from dozens of subjugated species. Krell and others were all present to witness the trial of Commander Zarthok, and, standing in the center of the chamber testifying before the council, was Daniel Price. Daniel was saying that Commander Zarthok's methods on the Krell colony produced superior results by every measurable metric, while also reducing resentment and potential for future rebellion. He said the question was not whether the approach worked, because data clearly showed it did, but whether the Empire was secure enough in its power to allow different methods when they proved more effective. High Chancellor Rektar, who was oldest and most traditional of the council members, fixed Daniel with a withering stare and said he was human, and his species faced conquest. So of course he advocated for softer approaches because he hoped to weaken them. Daniel replied calmly that actually he was advocating for them to be smarter. He explained that right now the Empire maintained control through fear, but fear was exhausting and required constant military presence and constant vigilance and constant displays of force. Daniel asked, what if they could maintain control through something more sustainable like subjects who chose to cooperate because they benefited from imperial structure rather than simply lacking power to resist? Another council member objected that he was describing integration, not conquest. Daniel corrected that he was describing empire building rather than empire taking. He said to look at human history, because their most successful empires were not the ones that ruled by pure force, because those all collapsed eventually, but their most enduring civilizations were ones that gave conquered peoples reasons to become willing participants rather than sullen subjects. Elder scholar Melkith, who was the empire's chief historian, rose to speak and said he had studied the fall of 7 previous galactic empires. He explained that all collapsed from internal rebellion, not external threat, and all were characterized by rigid hierarchical structures that treated subjugated species as resources rather than populations. Melkith said the Zarthok precedent might be unconventional, but it addressed the exact weakness that historically destroyed empires. The debate continued for hours with arguments for tradition versus innovation and control versus integration and fear versus cooperation. Zarthok listened, fascinated by how the conversation had evolved beyond his personal actions to question the fundamental structure of the empire itself. Daniel had done it again by not attacking directly, but by introducing questions that forced the empire to examine its own assumptions. Finally, High Chancellor Rektar called for silence and told Zarthok to present his defense. Zarthok stood before the council, aware of thousands of eyes on him, and he had prepared elaborate arguments and historical examples and strategic justifications. But standing there, he found himself discarding all of it in favor of simple truth. He said he had conquered 1,047 worlds, and each conquest added to his legend, and his pride and his reputation as the greatest military commander in Drakon history. He said he believed that strength meant domination, and power meant control, and the Empire's greatness was measured by territory held, and how completely they subjugated those within it. Zarthok paused and said, 9 months ago he met Daniel Price, who was unremarkable by any military standard, with no weapons or threats or leverage, but just a request for 1 year to help him understand humanity. He said he accepted because he was curious, and over these 9 months that humans systematically dismantled every assumption he held about strength and power and empire, not through sabotage or espionage, but through persistent, patient demonstration of alternative perspective. Zarthok said Daniel showed him that conquest alone was hollow, and an empire built purely on fear was inherently unstable, and true strength might mean building civilizations people wanted to join, rather than ones they were forced into. He explained the Krell Compromise was his attempt to test these ideas, and it worked because the colony was more productive and more stable and more peaceful. Zarthok's voice hardened as he said that realization forced an uncomfortable question about why they had not been using better methods if better methods existed. He asked if they continued refusing to use them despite evidence of effectiveness. Then what did that say about them? Were they truly the apex civilization they claimed to be, or were they simply the most violent species currently holding power? Rektar said coldly that Zarthok had been corrupted by alien influence and the human manipulated him. Zarthok agreed that yes, Daniel absolutely did manipulate him, but manipulation required deception, and Daniel never lied. He said Daniel showed him truth he had been avoiding, which was that 200 years of conquest had made him powerful, but not. The final 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings and negotiations and philosophical debates that Zarthok had never expected to be part of his military career. As special ambassador for imperial integration, he found himself consulting with representatives from dozens of subjugated species, and each offered perspectives on what worked and what failed in their relationships with the Empire. The patterns were clear to anyone willing to see them, because species that retained some cultural identity showed lower rebellion rates and higher productivity, while those completely stripped of heritage existed in states of simmering resentment that required constant military oversight. Zarthok told Elder Scholar Melkith during one late-night strategy session that they were inefficient because the Empire survived, not because their system worked well. but because they were powerful enough to make a broken system function through sheer force. Melkith agreed this had been true for 10,000 years, and the question was whether they could change without collapsing, because every empire that attempted fundamental reform either succeeded in becoming something entirely new or fragmented in the process. Zarthok asked if they either evolved or died, and Melkith said in the long term yes. But in the short term, they would muddle through with incremental changes and hope the accumulated weight of tradition did not crush them. Daniel spent the 2 weeks meeting with Earth's colonial government, via long-range communication and preparing them for whatever Zarthok decided. The conversations were tense because humanity knew it stood on the edge of survival, dependent entirely on whether one Drakon commander's personal transformation was sufficient to save them from conquest. Daniel told Zarthok during one evening conversation that they were preparing for war, because even if he decided not to conquer them, humanity knew now they were vulnerable. He said the Drakon Empire would not be the only threat out there, and humans needed to become stronger and more unified and more capable of defending themselves. Zarthok said that was wise because hoping for mercy from the powerful was not a survival strategy. Daniel asked if that was what this was, and if it was mercy. Zarthok admitted he did not know what to call it, because 9 months ago he would have conquered humanity without hesitation, since their technology was inferior and their worlds were scattered, and their military was laughably weak by imperial standards. He said conquest would have been trivial, but now when he imagined giving the order to invade Earth, he felt reluctance and doubt and something that prevented him from simply doing what he had done 1,047 times before. Daniel suggested he felt empathy because he spent 9 months getting to know a human, and watching his crew interact and seeing that humans were not so different from Drakon underneath biological variations. Daniel said Zarthok had humanized them, or rather recognized their personhood, and that made conquest morally complicated in ways it was not. Before, Zarthok mused that empathy as military weakness was what the traditional view would say, and Daniel had successfully exploited that weakness to save his species. Daniel asked what the non-traditional view said, and Zarthok replied that perhaps empathy was a strength he was missing all along, because understanding your enemy, really understanding them, gave you options beyond simple destruction. His mandibles clicked in what might have been dark humor as he said, acknowledging that meant acknowledging 200 years of conquest might have been incomplete and not wrong necessarily, but missing crucial dimensions of what it meant to interact with other civilizations. The deadline arrived on a clear morning, with 3 of the capital world's 5 suns rising in succession to bathe the city in golden light. Zarthok had requested a formal ceremony in the council chambers not for drama, but because his decision would set precedent that affected the entire empire. Whatever he chose would be watched and analyzed and referenced for generations. The chamber filled with observers including council members and military commanders and diplomatic representatives and journalists and hundreds of others who understood they were witnessing a potentially pivotal moment. Daniel Price stood in the center, looking remarkably calm for someone whose entire species' survival depended on the next few minutes. High Chancellor Rektar called the assembly to order and reminded everyone that 1 year ago Zarthok agreed to allow Daniel time to help him understand humanity. The agreement was that at the end of that year, he would render final judgment on whether humanity would be conquered and integrated into the empire, or allowed to remain independent. Rektar said that year had concluded, and asked what Zarthok's decision was. Zarthok stood before the council, aware his next words would define the rest of his existence. He said he stood before them having completed the most difficult campaign of his 200-year career, and not a campaign of military conquest, but one of personal transformation. Zarthok explained that Daniel asked for 1 year to help him understand humanity, and succeeded beyond any measure he could have anticipated. But in understanding humanity, he was forced to understand the Drakon Empire from an outside perspective and to see them as others saw them, rather than through the lens of their own cultural assumptions. He said what he discovered disturbed him profoundly, because the Empire's strength was real and undeniable, and they had conquered 1,047 worlds through superior military capability and strategic brilliance. But that strength had made them intellectually lazy, and they conquered because they could, and not because they needed to. and they subjugated species. Not because it served any greater purpose, but because expansion had become their default state of existence. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and Zarthok raised a hand for silence. He continued that Daniel broke his will to conquer, not through weakness but through persistent demonstration of alternative perspectives. Daniel showed him that strength without purpose was merely violence, and an empire built solely on fear was inherently unstable and inefficient. And the mark of true civilization was not how effectively you could dominate others, but how well you could integrate difference into functional cooperation. Zarthok announced his decision regarding humanity was that he recommended against conquest. The chamber erupted into chaos, with shouts of approval and outrage mixing into incomprehensible noise. Zarthok waited for order to return before explaining that he recommended against conquest, not because humanity was too strong to defeat, since militarily they remained inferior to imperial forces. He recommended against conquest because he had come to believe the Empire's standard approach to expansion was fundamentally flawed. They conquered worlds and stripped them of everything that made them unique, then wondered why. They must maintain massive military presences to prevent rebellion. He said they were exhausting themselves, maintaining an empire that almost no one wanted to be part of. Zarthok explained that humanity represented an opportunity to try something different, and rather than conquest, he proposed alliance, a mutual defense treaty, and trade agreements and cultural exchange, where they offered humanity access to imperial technology and protection from other galactic threats. In return, humans would maintain their independence but align their interests with the Empire. He said they would benefit from human creativity and perspective, which as the past year demonstrated could provide valuable insights that Drakon culture had blind spots around Vrektar's. Voice cut through the noise and said, Zarthok proposed allowing a species to remain independent simply because he had grown fond of one human representative, and this was sentiment, not strategy. Zarthok replied it was both and told them to consider the strategic implications. If they conquered humanity, they added 38 marginally productive worlds to an empire already struggling to maintain control over thousands, and created another resentful population requiring military oversight. They would gain resources they did not particularly need at the cost of goodwill and moral authority. But if they offered alliance instead of conquest, they demonstrated the empire could be something other than a predatory force, and showed subjugated species that cooperation was possible. This could potentially reduce rebellion rates across the empire, because they had acknowledged conquest was not the only relationship model available to them. Melkith interjected that they would also gain something unprecedented, which was a species that chose to work with them rather than being forced to submit. He said the intelligence and innovation that choice-based cooperation could produce often exceeded that of coerced labor. The debate continued for hours, with traditionalists arguing that showing weakness would encourage empire-wide rebellion, while reformers countered that traditional methods were unsustainable in the long term. Economists pointed out that human perspective had already improved efficiency in several imperial operations where Daniel's suggestions had been implemented. Military commanders worried about setting precedent that would undermine subjugation protocols. Finally, Vrektar called for a vote, and the decision would not be unanimous, but it would be binding. The results were closer than Zarthok had dared hope, with 12 council members in favor of alliance, and 8 in favor of conquest, and 3 abstaining. Humanity would remain independent with formal alliance. Negotiations to begin immediately. As the chamber cleared, Daniel approached Zarthok with an expression of profound relief and thanked him for saving his species.